turn it over to you.
Okay, it looks like we're ready to go here.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's Planning Commission meeting. I'm Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director for the City of Victoria. As we slowly begin the reopening procedures here at City Hall amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, we are currently still holding our public meetings remotely. We do hope to open these meetings up to be in person again very soon. But as a result of our meetings being remote, we are temporarily modifying how we will receive public comment on Planning Commission items. During meetings such as tonight's meeting that do not have a public hearing, comments should be sent to the Planning Commission electronically via email or using our online form. That form can be found at victoria.civicweb.net/portal under the meeting participation heading. You can also email Senior Planner Paul Moretto at PMORETTO@ci.victoria.mn.us. Those of you watching us live online or on Mediacom Channel 8, please be aware of the following. We do have a quorum of Planning Commission members who are participating in this meeting remotely. We are broadcasting this meeting live and are recording it so it can be viewed on demand. There is up to a 1-minute delay from the live meeting to the online cable broadcast, and we will also be taking all actions of the Planning Commission by a roll call vote. So thank you, everyone, and with that, I will turn it over to Acting Chair Moore to open the meeting.
Very good. All right. I will now call this meeting to order. Thank you very much, Marty. Appreciate that. Our first order of business is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. I'll do my best in Chair Stensland's absence, so bear with me here this evening. Members of the Planning Commission, before I ask for a motion, please state your name when moving and seconding. Obviously, we asked for this because we are not in person. Commissioners, is there a motion to adopt the final agenda?
Gar, so moved.
Is there a second?
Iverson.
Schwarting, I second.
Okay, motion made by Gar and seconded by Iverson. I'm now going to take the roll call vote. Commissioner Brownlee. Okay, looks like he's absent. Commissioner Kuhn.
Hey.
Commissioner Gar.
Aye.
Commissioner Iverson.
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarting.
Aye.
Commissioner Blazer.
Aye.
Commissioner Peterson.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries. Our next order of business.
Acting Chair Moore, just one moment. We also need your vote on those items as well.
Okay. Commissioner Moore, aye.
Thank you.
Our next order of business is to adopt the minutes from our January 7th. It's not correct. So it's going to be the minutes from our May 19th Planning Commission meeting. Reminder again, please state your name when moving and seconding. May I have a motion, please?
Commissioner Iverson, I move to approve the previous meeting minutes.
Is there a second?
Commissioner Kuhn seconds.
Okay, thank you. Motion made by Iverson and seconded by Kuhn. I'm now going to take roll call vote. Commissioner Kuhn.
Aye.
Commissioner Gar.
Aye.
Commissioner Iverson.
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarting.
Aye.
Commissioner Blazer,
Aye.
Commissioner Peterson,
Aye.
and Commissioner Moore. Aye. Thank you. Motion carries. We are now moving on to our discussion items. Thank you very much. Marty?
Yes, thank you. And I'll actually, I'll let Paul start. We will be tag teaming the presentation again tonight, but Paul, if you want to introduce the item and get into the presentation, that would be great.
Absolutely. Chair, Commission, thank you again. We are, again, continuing the process of updating our shoreline management ordinance. This was an item that was scheduled for our previous meeting, but as we know, the previous meeting went quite long into the night, and we decided to postpone that discussion until this meeting. And so tonight we're going to go over some of those items that we wanted to discuss regarding the shoreline management ordinance. Particularly, we wanted to bring the discussion that we had at our Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee meeting to the Commission for further analysis. Again, we're going to be presenting a summary of our May 5th meeting for our Planning Commission discussion and direction. We're also going to be providing our May 14th Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee, or also called committee, feedback that they provided. We're going to do some comparison of lot area and width of other communities, which I think is important to give context to this discussion. And then we're going to continue further items for discussion. I just wanted to make sure that it's known that this is a iterative process. This is not the end, but rather the beginning. Things that are discussed and some items that are brought forward for consideration are just that, items for consideration, and are not the end of the discussion. And so, you know, staff is very open to the concepts and ideas that are presented by each body as we move forward in this process to develop a ordinance that really reflects the values and goals of the city. With that, let's move on to our first slide. And before I continue there, I just want to make sure that you know, we're going to go through these a little bit quickly at the beginning, just to kind of get you the summary items. If you want to chime in, that's fine, but I think ideally we would wait until there's a small pause or break when we get to the PUD section, and maybe we can do some review from there. But again, if you do have some comments or suggestions, feel free to chime in. With that, I will continue on to our slide number 3. And so let's kick off by going over kind of the question, what was said during our May 5th meeting, and then we'll look at some of the results of our committee meetings that we had a week or two ago. And so the question that was before us was, what are the priorities for the city of Victoria as it relates to managing natural resources and development? And during our May 5th meeting, we generally came up with preserving and improving water quality, protecting shoreland, and creating natural setback and buffered areas that were of importance. And this is trying to get to, you know, making sure that preserving what needs to be preserved, protecting what needs to be protected, but also providing for, you know, real consideration of what we're trying to preserve, you know, a real analysis, if you will. The Lakes and Water Quality Committee also chimed in as well, which is on our next slide here. And they had quite a bit to say on this topic, and really it's about conservation and protection of the water and protection of property values was of concern to them. In addition, lakeshore standards being reduced from the current ordinance was a concern for them because they took a look at what the baselines were from our current ordinance and they compared that to what was proposed. And what we're proposing at this particular juncture is based off of the model ordinance of the DNR. And of course, you know, these are not items that are set in stone, but rather things that can be analyzed and where appropriate, make augmentations. Another item of concern was to preserve the public access to lake and create at least one public access point. Now, what was really important during that conversation was that it wasn't necessarily, you know, a boat landing, but rather a public enjoyment space. So this could be, you know, a place where there might be a picnic table or just a place to be able to view the lake and enjoy its qualities. An issue of concern to them as well was tree removal. Of course, that's been a topic of concern for quite some time now. And really, they were worried about this idea of being able to pay to remove. And they want to instead have a system by which you do replacement, and that's your only option. whether that's, perhaps maybe in an outlot or in a wooded vegetative space that requires it, or some sort of other process, but really being able to pay to remove was a concern for them. Also, as a part of that, they were very concerned about the idea of agricultural uses still being used as the residential or commercial piece of land is being phased into development. They're just worried that that runoff will continue to degrade the quality of the water, and that'd be something that should be addressed either through a limitation of certain uses or just a real management of that issue, and something that needs to be considered perhaps during the process of platting and pre-platting. Also, a desire to provide DNR shoreline training programs for commissioners, committee members, and staff. So this is similar to what we had during our 101, and I think the 101 was a great opportunity to really get to understand some of the intricacies of shoreline management and how the DNR views shoreline management through the state statutes. And the commission or the committee's recommendation was to continue that training, and even with some more detail. Next, please. Thank you. The next question that was asked was what types of residential densities are acceptable in the shoreland areas. During our May 5th presentation, the Planning Commission came to some agreement as to the desire to primarily allow riparian developments as single-family homes while preserving townhomes and multifamily developments for non-riparian parcels. So, keeping those higher uses, higher impact situations off of the shoreland where it could maybe degrade or erode. There's also desire to remain flexible on higher density developments within our mixed use areas, such as the downtown west 13.5 acre development, where we have developed that to the downtown that we have now, but making sure that we preserve that ability into the future for downtown west. The lake's water quality on our next slide had some more to contribute to that. There was a need to be careful to mitigate the stormwater control and should have higher standards depending on the density of the area. They just want to make sure that it's not necessarily a one size fits all, but rather that this is taken into analysis. There's also issues that catch basins and ponds be useful to maintain water quality, but we need to do a better job maintaining them. For example, we have a number of these throughout the city, and the question was who maintains them. For the most part, the city currently maintains them, but at least the majority of them. But there's issues about budget and how easy it is to do this and how we clean out that sediment. And they're worried about creating choke points within the system that would affect the rest of the watershed. Finally, there was a want to remain flexible to draw the right kind of development for our city, but flexibility shouldn't mean relaxing the rules. So there is concern that, if there's flexibility, that it's done in a way that's careful to be sensitive to those surrounding conditions and analysis is done. So making sure that the high quality flexibility is maintained. The next item of consideration was how should commercial developments occur within our shoreland? Again, to summarize our May 5th conversation, there was a desire to allow flexibility to continue development and redevelopment of the existing downtown central business district, but doing so in a way that's thoughtful. Again, it's kind of a common theme, which is making sure that, with development comes thoughtful analysis, and really, how does that formulate into the ordinance? The lake's water quality had more to say on this as well. They were very concerned about uses that could possibly discharge or release certain pollutants into the water system. They were worried that that might be hazardous to the water and to its quality, and so they felt that that should be prohibited. There should be, in their analysis, there should be different degrees of regulation based off the types of uses. So for the more intense uses, there'd be more analysis and prevention when it comes to runoff control. Also, alternative forms of infiltration, such as pervious pavers, rooftop gardens, and other forms of catching water before it hits the system, something that they were interested in commercial. Also, there's a feeling that there was some maybe lack of understanding, or perhaps there's not enough information yet about the impact of Highway 5 if it's expanded, what it will do to the community as far as increased discharge into our system. And so that's something that's important to look at as an analysis for commercial development throughout that corridor.
Good boy.
Pardon?
I'm sorry, I thought I was muted.
Oh, if there's a question, please let me know. So the next question was, should the city allow controlled access lots used to access public waters or as a recreation for owners of non-riparian lots? During our previous meeting, there was a desire to allow that flexibility through the conditional use permit that would review specific parameters of that particular development or a particular situation. And that would be something that would be carefully analyzed. Likewise, the Lakes Water Quality Committee agreed with that sort of thinking, and that the conditional use would be very appropriate in that situation to make sure that if one wants to go in, there's a public and very open discussion about whether it's appropriate for that particular area. There's a belief that these sorts of facilities are appropriate on larger bodies of water, but to be very sensitive of our smaller lakes, that they don't become an area that creates too much traffic or creates issues for water quality in that particular lake. Really, they thought that the ordinance should have a baseline of specifics that should be met to allow such a conditional use, so that there's guidance for decision makers as to what are the best items to really, dig into when it comes to those requests, so that there's guidance on that. For our next item, we have, how should the city handle non-conforming lots of record within the existing structure that would be removed or nearly removed? Again, our Planning Commission had a desire to provide flexibility with rebuilds, particularly through the variance process. Again, that's another open public meeting process where people can discuss the issue, and then the owner and the applicant can provide their analysis so that we can have a more informed discussion about the item. Our committee had additional items of consideration, such as adjacent property setbacks. So if there's a number of different properties that have, say, they're further back or closer, that those be considered as a part of the overall setback structure. The type of lake may make a difference as well, as far as it being a natural environment lake, which should be more restrictive in their view. Also, they're very concerned about the elevation above the ordinary high water level, because something that's further down towards the lake might be more impacted than something that's higher up on a bluff. And also, they're very concerned with anything that's built into a floodplain, that those sorts of things, whether it's conforming use or not, or non-conforming use, that we should be careful with anything that's in the floodplain. Next item here is, how should the city handle accessory structures and water-oriented structures in the shoreline areas? During our May meeting, there was value to allowing an additional water-oriented structure in addition to the requirements of the zoning code. So we currently allow the 2 of any 3, so you can have attached, detached, or shed. In the shoreline area, you could have a water-oriented structure, and so there was value to making sure that that structure is allowed to be built because of the nature of the lot itself. Our committee meeting, there was agreement that there's value to a water-oriented structure. They thought that this should require larger setbacks on natural environment lakes just because of the nature of the sensitivity, 25 feet versus 10 feet or some permutation of that. Also limit the size on recreational development lakes, such as up to a certain amount of feet, such as 400 on general developments. And the really question is, can we or do we want to allow plumbing in these facilities? There's different reasons why you would or would not. These areas might be useful for, bathing or, washing off certain areas of the boat or whatever it may be. But then again, if you had plumbing down there, it's just another opportunity for a leak or infiltration to happen into a lake that might not be desirable. And so those items were some of the very, high-level analysis that was done at that meeting. That kind of concludes this beginning portion. If there's any questions or comments, feel free to chime in now. And then afterwards, we're going to pass it on to Marty for the next section. Thank you.
Commissioners, are there any questions? Take that as a no.
Yeah, this is Terry Schwarting. If the city's not going to maintain any of these catch basins or ponds, why would we add any new ones?
Yeah, Commissioners, Chair, that's a good question. A lot of times these types of catch basins and ponds are required as part of that stormwater management procedure because they will filter out a lot of the pollutants and the sediments, and those things will go to the bottom before that water is then kind of pushed along down the rest of the watershed pathway, as you will, to get into our lakes. So they're very useful, and in fact, a lot of times required as part of that. And they do their job very well. The problem is that after a number of years, just like any of those more shallow water bodies, they begin to settle. It's doing its work, so it's settling that sediment in. And then there's some maintenance that needs to be done to dredge those and clean those out and get them back to their original use. So I think to answer the question as to why we would continue to use them is they are an important tool for managing stormwater. The question and I think the concern and the thing that we need to all talk about internally and as commissions is how do we move forward with making sure they are maintained properly, because if they do get filled in and they need maintenance, they're no longer doing their job.
To piggyback that, I just have a quick question. And this is to Marty and Paul. Do you know of any cities that have received money from associations annually and held it to be applied at a future date for the maintenance of these ponds? It seems like that process would allow the work to be actually done and enforceable.
Paul, are you familiar with any circumstances? I believe, and I'll let Paul piggyback onto the answer, but I believe that, and again, I apologize for my lack of all of the history on these items, but I believe that there was a point in time when we did these in developments that they were made the responsibility of the HOA. So not necessarily your point of requiring an HOA payment to hold in the fund, but they were the responsibility of the HOA, and they were not being maintained as they maybe needed to be. So at some point in time, the city made the switch in policy to have those retained in outlots so that the city would have that authority to do that. But again, it gets back to that budgeting issue and making sure you have the funds available. So I think that's a valid question. I don't necessarily know the answer to, but maybe Paul, if you have any additional insight.
I don't personally know of other communities that do that off the top of my head. But yeah, Marty, you're right as far as I think we had a transition period when it went from HOA to city. I think it was a matter of, being able to control and manage it to some degree. But again, that then transfers, financial liability for cleanup, to cities to maintain, which is very difficult and very expensive. I think, off the top of my head, I think we have over 70 of these, and, each one is extremely expensive to maintain, especially if it gets to the point where it needs to do, dredging, or you have to find somewhere to put that sort of materials. It's not easy to find where to put those materials. It's not as simple as, dropping it off at a landfill or something. So yeah, I mean, it's a legitimate, difficult question. These are things that, the watersheds and other jurisdictions require to maintain and to, direct our runoff as we develop. And, it's how do you leverage city resources, but also, this is a community issue as well. So yeah, it's a good question.
Commissioners, any additional questions on this first part of the presentation? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next piece where we'll dig into the weeds a little bit more on some of these other items. All right. I will take over. And again, thank you, Acting Chair, Commissioners. Again, Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director for the city. So as Paul just went over the summary of our very high level kind of philosophical governance questions that we discussed on the May 5th meeting, we also did have some more specific information that was presented to you about where we are starting from with this red line ordinance. As Paul mentioned, we did take the approach of using the DNR model ordinance as our starting point and working from there. So a lot of the things that are in that ordinance or in the current red line ordinance that are of lower standard of the city's existing shoreline ordinance are part of that DNR model ordinance. And we'll be talking about those in more detail today to really get some discussion and some better direction as to what the Planning Commission would like to see. You know, again, whether that's maintaining what we currently have in our ordinance, looking at some other combination or what have you. So one of those items that we discussed was the residential planned unit development process within the shoreline. So right now, our existing shoreline ordinance does not have a prescribed PUD process. When we've handled PUDs in the past, they've gone through the standard PUD process and discussion and meetings, but there was not necessarily any specific requirements of a developer as part of that PUD. It was really more open, as you'd think of in a traditional PUD where there's negotiation and public meetings and input. The DNR model ordinance has a much more prescribed process for those residential PUDs in Shoreland. I noted the section in the model ordinance there is section 10 and specifically 10.5, where they basically provide a formula to help the commissions and city councils, if they're going to consider a PUD, determine what that level of density should be when that is calculated out through that process. And I'm going to actually walk through that a little bit because it's somewhat confusing in a couple of slides. But in addition to that, it also has some requirements as far as dedicating open space and maintaining some buffer area. And as you'll recall, we, in the initial red line that we've provided, staff had included an item that would dedicate a public buffer of 150 feet along that shoreline in lieu of requiring a full 50% of open space to reduce that to 25%. The rationale behind that was really to try to have that city protection of the shoreline. But we'll discuss that as we continue. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. The Lakes and Water Quality Committee, similar to the broader level questions, their feedback on this item, they had concerns about that full 150 feet shoreline dedication. And interestingly enough, some of the concerns we heard from that committee was that it would not have allowed a development such as the Waterford to take place, where you've got some controlled access lots if the city were to require that 150 feet of shoreline dedication. So there was some discussion that if we decided to go that route, can the city allow the developer to set aside a portion of that shoreline for those controlled access lots in PUDs when they make sense? And then they also had a similar question, which the Planning Commission had at its last discussion on this, as to what are the pros and cons between the shoreline dedication versus the full 50% open space as is prescribed in the DNR model. And then there was also some concern about creating enforcement issues with any city dedicated buffer area along that shoreline. We do have several of those in the city, and I think they do a good job of creating that natural buffer, but they do come with those enforcement issues, as many, if not all of them, abut backyards of properties. So it becomes very easy as a homeowner to start to encroach into that area, look at it as an extension of your backyard. So there was some conversation as to whether or not we want to continue to create those situations, and if we do, we probably need to have some more teeth in our ordinance for enforcing buffer issues. So next slide, please. Sorry, I need to grab a little bit of water. So I wanted to just kind of talk through just a minute what we're talking about when we're talking about the tiering. Excuse me, I'm going to cough here. I'm going to go on pause. Paul, you want to tap dance for a minute?
Sorry, I was currently muted. So, yeah, so again, this is important for us to look at as far as how we look at tiering and density and how we look at our analysis for overall site density. And so with this item, we're looking at, how a parcel in the shoreline area is then tiered amongst its many components, as far as a distance away from the lake based on the type of development or type of lake as well. Again, making sure the classification is taken into account. Really, it's about making sure that each tier adheres to a certain level of density, a certain level of development that's required, and also when we look at those potential buffers, how that interacts as well.
Thanks, Paul. I think I'm back. I apologize for that, commissioners. I had a cough coming on there. Paul, we'll sign you up for the next Broadway show for the tap dancing abilities.
Yeah,
but as Paul, as Paul was saying, so this is actually, these excerpts in the next couple of slides are from the DNR as they try to walk through what they really mean by their requirements within the residential PUD. And part of that requirement is that if a developer does not want to go straight zoning and they want to go the PUD route, they have to look at that piece of property in tiers. So the first thing they're asking them to do is divide their property into tiers based on certain dimensions that are also prescribed in that ordinance. This example that's shown here is a recreational development lake, and in a recreational development lake, they ask that those tiers be 267 feet. So the first step of trying to walk through the PUD process in this scenario is you divide it into those tiers. So you're kind of seeing what they're doing there with their 267-foot wide chunks, kind of shown with those dotted lines. So if you go to the next slide, once you've drawn those tiers, their next step is to calculate what the suitable area is for development. So when they do that, they're saying you need to provide the total area in square footage and then exclude any wetlands, bluffs, or land below the ordinary high water line from that total area. So the areas that would not be buildable regardless of whether being in a shoreland zone or not. So step two then gets you the math of saying, all right, I've got my entire area in each of those tiers broken down. I've subtracted the unsuitable for building areas, and that provides you then with a suitable area in each tier to be able to build. So then to determine how much density is allowed as part of that PUD, they then say in step three that you divide that suitable area within each tier by the minimum single residential lot area for that relevant water body. So for example, in our current ordinance, I believe our riparian recreational development lots are an acre. So everything in the first tier would be divided by 43,000 square feet. And then for the tiers that are not riparian, you would use the non-riparian, which I believe is currently 20,000, and divide that by the suitable area. So that then gives you a base density, and that calculation is, again, changes depending on what the straight zoning is for those different lake bodies. And then you'll see here in this example that they've provided, they've got in the DNR model, the 20,000 for riparian lots would give them a base density of 6 in that first tier, and then using the 15,000 square feet for the additional tiers, 11 and just about 19 as a base density. So if you go to the next slide, once you've gotten that base density, they're asking then to determine if that site can accommodate that density and any increased density. So if it can require and meet all of those design standards, again, in the DNR model ordinance, that includes that 50% open space, Then they allow the bonus density to be considered, and that's really where you get to being able to allow some additional density than you would under straight zoning. So to take advantage, as it says here, of that bonus density, there are some additional requirements related to ordinary high water line setback that can be reduced with vegetative management. But they provide a calculation. So in the first tier, you're allowed an additional 50% bonus of whatever your base density is. You're 100% bonus in the second tier and a 200% bonus in the third tier. So you can see in that circled area where it then provides the number of houses that would be available to be built in each of those tiers. So that gives the Planning Commission, it gives staff, it gives the City Council, as they're looking at these, a little bit of guidance as to what, at least from the DNR side of things, they deem as acceptable density when going the PUD route and providing those open space and some of those shoreline protections. And then you can see just a mock-up of example of what that would look like or could look like as it's platted onto those tiers. You are able to, under the DNR's model ordinance, you are able to move density from a closer to the water tier to a farther to the water tier, but not vice versa. So in this example, there's 10 allowable units in the tier 1. They're proposing 7. They can then move those 3 tiers up into either tier 2 or tier 3, but you cannot go the other way. So that's just, I know there's a lot of, and it's a little bit of a complicated math equation to figure this out, but I thought it was important to at least talk through this briefly as to what we mean when we're talking about the tiering situation for PUDs. Are there any questions on that before I move on?
Marty, can you repeat the distance for each tier, please?
Yeah, it is dependent on the lake type. So this is a recreational development lake. It is 267. I would have to pull up the DNR's model again, which I should be able to do relatively quickly. I want to say that in a natural environment lake, it is a larger number for tier 1, and then it reduces down. Give me 1 second here. So when we're talking sewered lots, it is general development that has different tiers. So in a general development lake, tier 1 for a sewered lot is 200 feet. And actually, I guess it is only different for non-sewered. So all other tiers are 200. So general development lake tiers are 200 feet. A recreational development lake tiers are 267 feet. And for natural environment lakes, tiers are 320 feet. So again, those are prescribed distances from the DNR model ordinance.
Thank you.
Any additional questions on this piece on the tiering? Hopefully folks have a little better understanding of what that means when we're talking about the tiering model under PUD. All right, let's move to the next slide, please. So based on some of the feedback we've received both from Planning Commission, from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee, some of the public feedback that was included as part of your packet, the item that we're really looking for some discussion and some initial direction on related to these residential PUDs has to do with the overall methodology, whether that's something we think is a good thing and works for our community. And then specifically some discussion on that 150 feet of shoreline dedication and a 25% open space requirement as opposed to a straight 50 open space requirement is in the DNR model ordinance. We also have in the current red line, which I think is a discussion point for the commission tonight, is that anything that is multi-unit, we would require to go through a PUD process. So there would not necessarily be any straight zoning in those residential shoreland districts or multi-unit housing, which I think speaks to some of the things we've talked about, ensuring the water quality and the sizes of those lots and areas are what is best for the community through a public process. And then also, and this is prohibited on certain lake types in our current ordinance, but not all of them. But that multi-unit housing would be prohibited on any non-sewered properties. That does not impact much of the current Victoria city limits. Where that could come into play is that if in the future the city were to retain any planning and zoning authority for any of the annexation area properties that are within a shoreland, the city would not necessarily want to allow a big multi-unit housing development to go up on an unsewered property without going through that process. So again, it's not a huge impact as much of the city is now sewered, but that's more of a consideration for future annexation areas. And then in that second column, we've just provided a few options. Again, I don't think anything is off the table for part of that discussion, but whether or not the Planning Commission prefers that 50% open space versus the shoreline dedication, or is there a different combination? Thoughts on stronger enforcement and penalties for encroachment into buffers. The point we brought up earlier about if we were to require a shoreline buffer, is there any desire to allow a developer to maintain a portion of that for controlled access lots? And then are there other thoughts on how to handle multi-unit housing in these areas? And with that, I'd turn it over to the chair to lead some discussion on this item before we move on.
Thank you very much, Marty and Paul. Appreciate all of your detail and information on this. So throughout our agenda, there's detailed definitions of everything that helps us kind of understand this a little bit more clearly with some graphics and illustrations, which is nice. I guess I'll just open it up and first ask if anyone has any feedback that they'd like to initially discuss, and then we can go from there.
This is Terry Schwarting. When we kind of went to the 150 feet of shoreline and 25%, I thought our thinking was it was really going to be pretty similar to the 50% open space, just kind of done a different way. But, I'd be very happy to follow more DNR guidelines and move to their model personally.
I think one thing that I'd like to avoid is with the PUD for multi-unit housing, I would like to make sure that the minimum standard is pretty clear. Obviously, we know a PUD provides flexibility for the city, but I think the minimum standard, that just has to be pretty obvious for a potential developer.
Commissioner Iverson, I had reviewed the packet, and I am actually quite impressed with the how tight that the DNR's recommendations are. And that I don't see any problem with
John, we're having a hard time hearing you. I think Commissioner Iverson was just saying that he didn't have a problem with I could be wrong with the DNR's philosophy. I don't know. John, please chime in if I'm wrong. There's certainly a lot of measures in here to keep the environment safe and intact, and keep the waterways safe.
Yeah, that actually is precisely what I had stated. I have MediaCom, and MediaCom is about the most unreliable method on this. But yeah, I think the DNR's standards, they really do keep them very tight. And reviewing the packet, I was quite impressed with the standards.
This is Commissioner Blazer. Was this an area where I think you had talked last time where we were going to get tighter on something in order to try and get leniency somewhere else?
Commissioner Blazer, members of the commission, yes, this was one of our items of additional protection of saying that, you know, we're going to look to dedicate that shoreline. However, again, by reducing the open space requirement to 25% versus 50%, I think those two items likely offset themselves from the DNR's standpoint. So by losing that shoreline protection and just going to the straight 50% versus, and we're no longer asking for the 25%, I don't know that that necessarily impacts for other areas because those two pieces probably offset one another.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to ask a question, and I'm sorry if this sounds a little elementary, but can you compare the difference between open space and shoreline?
From a calculation standpoint, you would be able to determine what that difference is between 50% and 25%, including that shoreline. So there would be other spaces within that area that would be dedicated that you'd add to that 150 feet of shoreline. So in a specific development example, I think you'd be able to do the math and say, okay, if you had this 150 feet of shoreline, here's the other areas that are going to be retained as outlots. Let's take that square footage based on the total square footage and what percentage of that entire property is that now creating as preserved space, and you'd be able to compare, are we at 40%, are we at 50%, are we at 25% total with that? But outside of doing that calculation on a development by development basis, I don't know that you'd be able to make that determination. We likely could go through an exercise if we kind of just picked out a parcel and did a full study of that. We'd maybe be able to kind of see how those two would compare. But I think it would really come down to each individual parcel as to what that ends up being. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. Mm-hmm. In the back of my mind, I do think though about like our topography around the lakes. And because of, you know, these regulations, I could see how 25% would be increased based on setbacks because of the inclines surrounding the lakes.
And this is Paul. You know, there may be some additional, I don't know, discussion about what would be, you know, a developer give as far as developable shoreline, you know, something that they would already be able to develop or something that's impossible to develop anyways. You know, for example, steep slopes, bluffs, protected areas, wetlands, so on and so forth. Because I mean, they have to dedicate, for example, wetlands. That's something that has to be brought into the public realm anyways.
I think, and again, I'll let Paul chime in on his opinion on this as well. I think the thought, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, but I think the thought process behind the 150 feet of shoreline versus just the straight 50% open space is that then if a developer did want to have some increased density, so they wanted to go through that process and say, I want to put some additional density in here than is allowed via straight zoning, that as a return to the city on that is that there would be a requirement of, okay, then that means you have to provide us that shoreline, which we can then protect. So essentially in a PUD process, there would be no riparian lots. Using the 50% open space, and again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. It's really just a matter of what we think is best for Victoria. There is an opportunity for riparian lots to be developed as part of a PUD because there would not be that requirement. There would certainly be, as prescribed in the DNR model, some required shoreline protections that needed to be in place, but I believe it would allow for those riparian lots as part of a PUD as well. So that's kind of been the internal discussion as to pros and cons of each variation. So I really think, and I really value the feedback from both this committee or commission and the Lakes and Water Quality Committee as to what we think is the best thing for Victoria.
So it sounds like we're saying that we find the DNR's regulations to be something we're pretty comfortable with at this point.
Great. Commissioner Moore, commissioners, just to recap, because we are going to take some of this direction to revise that red line prior to our next joint meeting with the Lakes and Water Quality Committee. It sounds like it is the commission's intent. We should revise that to go back to the DNR model, including the 50% open space versus the 20 or the 150 feet of shoreline. And so we will do that. And then we also, it sounded like we want to make sure we've got some minimum standards included for multi-unit development or multi-unit housing within these shoreland areas, that there's not an opposition to requiring that to go a PUD route, but we want to have some minimum standards. Is that accurate of the direction?
That was my personal opinion, not necessarily reflective of the entire commission, but I think it's helpful. I think it creates a roadmap, and it allows our objectives to be met without initial opposition.
This commissioner, I agree. That's something that I would share at the same time.
Commissioner Iverson, can you try repeating that one more time?
If you would share what had previously been stated.
I wish Cisco WebEx had a chat feature.
Yeah, sorry, Commissioner Iverson, you were still breaking up. We weren't able to catch that.
Yeah, well, I see different over the weekend, and I think it's MediaCom that's the culprit on this. So I'll hold my comments if,
We can
if I'm
hear you.
breaking up that often.
We can hear you. Keep talking.
Okay. Yep. Super. That's it. It kind of cuts in and cuts out. It had dropped out completely before, but yeah, I think what we had discussed is just truly it, again in reviewing the pack. You know, I was quite impressed with the standards that the DNR had presented. I thought they were pretty tight. At the same time, so I don't hate on that.
All right. Well, Chair, Commissioners, hearing no opposition to that, that's what we'll work on amending to our next meeting. Again, we have several meetings to discuss these, both bodies, so that doesn't mean that what is put in there next time needs to stay, but that's the direction we'll take and bring back for our next meeting on that specific issue. Next slide, please. So the other specific item that there has been some discussion and feedback from is the current red line, which includes some changes in required lot size and lot width in shoreland areas, as well as a reduction in ordinary high water line setbacks from current ordinance. As I mentioned earlier, we were taking those lot area sizes and those setbacks from the DNR model ordinance, but that's not to say that Victoria cannot have higher standards. So we'll walk through a little bit of that and look for some discussion and direction as well. The next slide, please. The Lakes and Water Quality Committee on this item, some of their feedback was those concerns that these new standards are less restrictive than the current ordinances and that they go against Victoria's character. There was specific concerns with the reduction from the current ordinance for recreational development lakes, and there was some comments made about if you're looking for that density, why not just go to a PUD? There was discussion about the reduction of setbacks creating problems if adjoining lots are set back farther from the lake. So you could potentially create a condition where two lots on either side of a property that's being rebuilt now has a shorter setback, so they're pushed up closer to the lake than their neighboring properties. There was some discussion about whether or not natural environment lakes should be use some sort of tiered model for development, just as part of its straight zoning on that, where you'd provide less density closer to the water, similar to the PUD process, but specifically just for the straight zoning of those lakes. There was also some discussion about whether or not there is any sense to creating different standards for existing lake development, so lakes within the city limits that are currently mostly, if not completely developed, and having some potentially less restrictive standards for future lakes in our development areas. So that was something that was talked about. And then there was also a desire to make sure that whatever is decided, that it's done in a way that can preclude flag lots from being developed. So if we move on to the next slide. This is just a comparison again. We saw a very similar table when we met last time, and now with a little deeper dive into this. This is showing what the lot areas and widths are in both the City of Victoria's current ordinance, what the current red line ordinance has, and the DNR model ordinance has. So you can see for everything outside of the natural environment non-riparian lots, which was an item that, as you know, we talked about last meeting that we were potentially looking at as a flexibility request. Those other reductions from the current ordinance are based off of the DNR model ordinance. The reason you are seeing the 80 feet versus 75 feet in the recreational development lakes is because 80 is our minimum standard for non-shoreland areas. So we certainly didn't want those widths to be less than that. And then the general development lake was really just to try and round those numbers off in that red line ordinance as opposed to what is in the current ordinance. So you can kind of see the comparison there, again, based off of that DNR model for those lot areas and widths. So if we go to the next slide, this is showing the same thing for non-sewered properties. So those, again, those were sewered properties. This would be for non-sewered properties. And again, those numbers that are a reduction in the current ordinance are based off of that DNR model ordinance. Again, really not as impactful in the current city limits, but potentially impactful as we continue to grow into our annexation area. So next slide, please. Similar thing with the setbacks. You're seeing those reductions in the current red line version that are in line with the DNR model ordinance that we can discuss tonight. Next slide, please. And then there was a question at the last Planning Commission just as to how these things compare to some of our neighboring cities when it comes to their ordinance. So these next couple of tables are really just a snapshot of a few of our neighboring communities and then as well as some of our market cities as to what they are using for their different standards when it comes to shoreland development. So you'll see currently we've got our current ordinance and the proposed ordinance, and then as you go down the table, you'll see what that comparison is with those different cities. This was provided in your background packet, so I won't spend a ton of time on this unless there are specific questions, and we can always come back to this slide as part of the discussion. So next slide, please. Similar table, this is showing the lot widths for those areas and how they compare to our neighboring cities as well as to how they compare to some of our market cities in that area. And you'll see this one is a little more across the board. There's some variation as you're looking down those columns, but most places are close to in line with what the DNR model ordinance is calling in this situation. Next slide, please. And then the last table here is just showing those setback items, which I know has been some concern from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee and some of the public feedback we've received with those reductions. And this is just showing a comparison to what some of those other communities are using for their ordinary high water line setbacks as opposed to what Victoria has. So next slide, please. So this is again where I will turn it back to the chair for commission discussion. As I said, I know there's been some planning commission discussion, and we've also received some feedback about concerns about reductions in those areas, specifically recreational development lakes, but from the current ordinance to those DNR standards, and at least some expressed desire to maintain the standards that are in place. So a few things we'd be looking at for direction tonight is the Planning Commission's thoughts on those standards, whether there's a desire to maintain current city standards, go to DNR standards, is there somewhere in between? Again, I mentioned there was the question about introducing tiers as part of straight zoning. And then back to that question about is there any desire to look at different standards for our developed lakes versus our currently undeveloped lakes. And with that, I will turn it over to the chair, and we can jump back to any of those slides as needed as part of the discussion.
Thank you, Marty. So the proposed setback changes, they really impact all the lakes. Most significantly, the recreational lakes. Is it possible to put that screen back up that shows one of the that's fine. I think it's important to understand the history of kind of how our calculations were initially created. And so I'm just curious if we have any historical information on kind of where these numbers came from and how we decided on these setbacks, these minimum setbacks from the beginning. Do we have any background information on that?
I believe that the city's existing shoreland ordinance was based off of the older version of the DNR model ordinance. Now, whether or not those setbacks come from that, that's something I'd have to look into. But I do believe that the DNR has updated their model ordinance relatively recently, which is one of the reasons why we're going through this process. So I believe there was that is what the basis of our existing shoreline ordinance is. I do not know, however, and I can look and try to find out whether or not that's where those numbers came from, or if there's any additional historical context when this last version of the ordinance was put in place.
Okay. Commissioners, does anyone have any initial thoughts?
There's one, this is Mary Jo, I'd like to bring up. In reading the materials for today's meeting, and especially reading the citizen comments, reference was made to the Waterford development and how they had many discussions with the city on their parameters for development. How does that, and how well it turned out? I know nothing about that development. I wish we could see a comparison maybe to what is proposed here, or if someone could explain the difference or why Waterford worked out so well.
Yeah, Commissioner Gar, Commissioners, so the Waterford development was done through the PUD process. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we did not have a prescribed shoreland PUD process, so it was done through the standard PUD process of the city, which involves the public meetings and the things you're all familiar with. So that development does not meet the existing straight zoning standards on those lakes. It is smaller lot sizes. It is, I believe, smaller widths. As I understand, there was a lot of discussion about that controlled access lot, and that was part of the PUD process. So any development that would be similar to the Waterford development would be would still, even under this updated ordinance, would still be something that would go through a PUD process. I believe, if I'm interpreting the public feedback concern correctly, and I don't want to speak for anyone, but the concern is that is with the reduction of what the straight zoning would be, particularly on those recreational development lakes. So right now, we are saying, if you have, in our current ordinance, if you want to build a riparian lot on a recreational development lake, it needs to be an acre. And if you do that and you've got all the other zoning, there's no public process to that. It's part of the straight zoning that they're allowed to do. In this updated ordinance, that would reduce that about in half. So instead of, if you had an acre property, that could potentially be 2 lots versus 1 lot. And I think that is the crux of the concern, is that we're providing for too much flexibility with our straight zoning that would not require a public process. The Waterford development, however, I know it was brought up a lot. The Waterford development as it is today, and even if we were to turn what the current ordinance is, or the current red line ordinance into an ordinance, would have likely still required a PUD process and would have gone through that same public feedback component and public meetings and public hearings. The difference is that whatever the straight zoning requirements are, if a lot can meet those straight zoning requirements, there's not a public process. And again, I believe the biggest concern is that we would be reducing reducing that straight zoning where essentially it's required that only one home could be built. You could potentially build two.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Was the Waterford project on Lake Minnetonka?
Schutz.
Yeah, Lake Schutz. So that is a recreational development lake. And just for a little additional context, I know we reviewed this last meeting, but most of the lakes in Victoria and in our annexation area are recreational development lakes. We do have some natural environment lakes, and we have many more of those in our annexation area, so they become a little bit bigger player as the city grows. The only general development lake that has buildable property within the city limits is Lake Minnetonka. Bavaria is also classified because a portion of Bavaria is in Victoria, so it's noted in our ordinance, but Victoria doesn't have any buildable or developable land around Bavaria, so it's noted as a general development lake, but it doesn't really come into play. So that's kind of the breakdown of the lake situation.
I'm curious which lakes would be impacted the most by this.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think the biggest change from the current city ordinance to the DNR model ordinance standards are those recreational development lakes. And Alyssa, I don't know if you can go, I actually tagged that because I thought we might need to go back to that. At the very end of this presentation, I think I've got my table that shows the different lake classifications as like the very last slide. There it is. So there you can kind of see a breakdown of the lakes that are currently within city boundaries. We did add Marsh Lake in there, which technically is not currently in, but is probably the nearest water body for annexation. But these are the lakes that we'd be discussing and their categorization. And so really you're looking at these lakes in the right-hand column that, as the DNR model ordinance prescribes, would be a reduced standard from what our current ordinance.
It's really interesting. I mean, in comparison to some of the other cities, I mean, we've been quite restrictive and historically.
This is Mary Jo again. It seems like our restrictiveness has been a quality that people admire, and one of the reasons they move here. I wish we had a map or a picture in front of us showing us where all these lakes are. And are these lakes undeveloped? I know, or are they semi-developed?
Paul and Alyssa, any chance you can pull up our GIS map, and maybe Paul, you can talk through a little bit about some of the different lakes and the things that are going on around them?
It'd be nice, just be very helpful, I think. And then, of course, as we annex more property, we will annex more lakes, correct?
Correct.
This is Paul, Chair and Commission. We're bringing up that map here of the lakes within the jurisdiction, as well as so when it comes to developable lots within the current boundary, it's pretty limited. You know, we have one parcel that's in the Shoreland district on Lake Bavaria that has some pretty limited footprint. We have some developable acreage on Lake Minnetonka. In addition to that, there is a few lots that are possible for development on Schitt's Lake as well on the north side. But when we look at Wasserman, that's almost completely developed. Carl Cray, the same way. Same goes with Church Lake and Kelter Pond. Lake Auburn is pretty much well developed just because the lakes or the Parks District has basically the majority of the lake. As we go south, Marsh Lake is the next to be developed, although you know, there's some ongoing activity on and around that lake that will probably continue on for some time. The next possible, most likely to occur for development would be on Pearson's Lake. Again, there's you know, almost half the lake or shoreland is already parcelized or subdivided. There are, you know, some acreage as far as large lots or large chunks of land that are available on the west side as well as the southwest and east, northeast side. But as you go into like Turbid, again, it's pretty limited in size compared to the rest of the lakes. It's, you know, more comparable to a Carl Cray. And as you go north into Letson Lake and Parley Lake, again, that's probably, you know, 40, 50, 60 years down the road as we look towards our 2050 and 2060 plans. So, I mean, you're talking about, you know, a lot of time, a lot of ability to really do a deep analysis on how this will impact before we get into some of these areas.
It seems to me that the density that is already established on these lakes because of the laws of Victoria should be maintained. It shouldn't, for instance, if I had a lot that was proper, say it was zoned for 1 acre or 2 acres, and then we changed and went to the DNR standards, it could happen that quite a few lots could be subdivided. We'd end up with more people on our lakes. Is that correct?
Commissioner Gar, commissioners, yes, that would be accurate. If we were to go with those DNR standards on some of those lakes, those parcels that are currently large enough to be able to do so could potentially be split.
Just personally, I don't think that's a good thing. Thank you.
And if I could chime in really quick, you know, there's also a couple different factors to think about, which is we have, you know, use of the lake as far as like traffic and the amount of boats and, you know, the general use of the lake. Then we have another idea, which is, you know, the impervious surface impact that we're creating on those lakes. And that's a function of density, but it's also a function of, you know, impervious surface limits in general. And so it's, you know, it's a number of factors that go into the consideration of, you know, how we look at this. You know, if there's, you know, smaller lots with lower density or lower amount of impervious surface, is that as impactful as a slightly larger lot, but they have more impervious surface available to them? I mean, it's you know, it's about taking those concepts and trying to figure out what's the right balance for these lakes. And, you know, are we using, you know, all of the tools at our disposal to figure out that balance?
Good point. Many other factors involved besides acreage. Thank you.
Well, I thought the changing of the setback on Lake Minnetonka. So if I subdivided my acreage, and then the other new person only asked to setback 50, where I had to do 100, and I got a house kind of sitting in front of me, right? Is there a way that you could, you know, grandfather, you keep the existing parameters for the older established lakes, and then you go more to the DNR model for newer development?
And I that is something, again, that the Lakes and Water Quality Committee had brought up as part of the discussion. I think that it's something that could be explored. I think it's something we'd want to discuss with the DNR if that's something that the commissions and committees thought was a valid idea. I mean, you can write an ordinance to say or do whatever we want it to say, right, within the purview of the law. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we do something that is acceptable to the DNR. But it's certainly something we could have those conversations about. And then just to back up just a little bit related to the setback item, the DNR model ordinance does account for that. They do have a provision about setback averaging. That's included. So if you end up in those situations where all of a sudden a middle lot has a less restrictive setback requirement, that there is still a requirement that you have to do some averaging between the two neighboring properties on either side, so that you don't end up with that condition where you've got one house 50 feet from the high water line, and then the two on either side of it are 100 feet. So it does speak to that. It likely does result in that middle house getting a little closer than the existing two, but there is a provision in there for that.
Okay, good, thanks.
This is Commissioner Pedersen. I'm I believe, the same agreement with Commissioner Gar and Commissioner Schwarting in that I'd like to see the old ordinance apply to all of the lakes that are currently developed or under development, and then look at these new ordinances going into place for newer developed lakes. I just think of the nightmare scenario of dividing my neighbor's lot. Now I have two houses that are 50 feet closer to the lake. Yes, there's going to be some averaging and things like that go into it, but I wouldn't be too happy about it. I think if we start stacking up more houses onto some of these lakes that have already been developed, it's not a good thing for Victoria. What is the problem with essentially creating a grandfather clause for some of the older lakes and creating these new ordinances for the new development to draw in people or draw in developers to develop those? Is there a problem with that or not? I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Pedersen, I think from some of the feedback we've heard from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee is that the only potential concern with those items is that it does increase the impact on the lake. But again, we are working with what the DNR has provided as a standard. So I think that's a valid point to look into if it's something that the commission desires.
I think our standards now are probably a little bit constrictive for bringing in new developers. If we can build twice as many houses closer to the water in Lake Elmo, why wouldn't I go there versus Victoria? That would be, the counter view to it. Anyway, thank you.
This is Mary Jo again with another question. Looking at the broader picture, the charts that you showed us with the neighboring communities and what their regulations are, how are these communities dealing with this proposed new ordinance?
So Commissioner Gar, most of the standards, as you can see when you're looking at this, fall pretty close to being in line with the DNR standards. Yep. I did not look at each of these to see when their last update has happened or when they've updated their shoreland ordinance. I believe some of these communities likely have updated since the DNR has updated their model ordinance a few years ago. But so I guess I can't specifically answer that at this meeting as to what other considerations or concerns or issues other communities have had as they've looked to update that. That's something else I can add to our list of homework to do prior to our next meeting.
Thank you.
I'd be curious to know why the DNR updated their shoreline ordinance with less setbacks. Or excuse me, but lot widths.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Acting Chair Moore, I am not sure or certain that the former ordinance had those, had higher standards. That's something that I want to look into to see what their old ordinance has. So just to clarify, I'm not 100% certain that they were drastically reduced, but as I look into that, and if we find that is the case, they have reduced that. That's another question I can ask to them and what their thought process and rationale to that was.
Curious do we have the ability to, I think I know the answer to this. Do we have the ability to have zoning, or actually let me rephrase, do we have the ability to change widths and setbacks to specific lakes? I mean, can we have, actually, I think what I'm hearing is people saying that the recreational development lakes, the future ones to be developed, those are maybe of more interest to have these updated measures, but can we specify lakes? Because as this is here, I mean, we don't have that ability. I mean, all recreational development is lumped together.
Right, Acting Chair Moore, Commissioners, I think if it is the pleasure of the commission to look into that possibility, that's a conversation I'd also like to have with the DNR. A, just to see if they are amenable to that, and B, to see if they are aware of any other communities that maybe have done that, where they've created some different standards for different areas, even though they are classified the same. I would have to think, and again, I'm making assumptions, and everyone knows what happens when you make assumptions, is that, but my assumption would be that as long as the least restrictive standard is still part of their DNR or falls within their DNR model ordinance, that there wouldn't be much of a concern with that. But again, making assumptions. So I'd like to have those conversations.
This is Commissioner Blazer. I like the idea too of looking at splitting it between existing development lakes and future development lakes. And as far as the actual proposed numbers that we're proposing, where there's reductions and concerns, maybe we can look at just becoming the highest standard in our neighboring cities, somewhere in between what our current standard is and what the proposed is. So if you're looking at this page, Riparian Chanhassen is 90 feet. Maybe we match that 90 feet or go to 100.
This is Paul. Just a thought while I'm hearing these comments and concerns is, you know, one thing you want to keep an eye out for is making sure that there's a practical nexus between the thing that's trying to be regulated and the condition which is being regulated. But like, for example, a thing that could be done, again, the DNR would have to chime in on this, as Marty has said already, but, you know, it'd be creating, like, say, a Schutz Lake overlay or a Wasserman Lake overlay. So it'd be an overlay specific for that lake. That way there's a clear connection between what you're trying to do from a regulatory standpoint and the nexus between the health and safety that you're trying to produce within the lake.
Also, in other words, are you saying that the existing development would be grandfathered?
That would be something that, you know, could be possible through, say, like a Wasserman Lake overlay district or something like that. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to pick lakes that are, you know, winter lakes and, you know, lakes that are more heavily regulated based off of nothing more than its temporal situation. If you want to do something that has like a clear logic between why this lake needs this regulation versus why that other lake needs that regulation. The DNR has produced, their general development and their recreational development as their baseline for doing that, based off of, water use, density types, and all this other stuff. If we wanted to create a hierarchical system of, existing lakes versus future lakes, then that again would need to be thought out as to what the, clear rationale for that is. I think, one is, there's already a large amount of development already, and therefore that's the rationale, but it just has to be well-founded.
So Paul, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, that in this hypothetical situation, if we were to look at something like this and the DNR were to be amenable to that, you would have your base ordinance would be the less restrictive standards, and you would then create an overlay district that's defined for those other lakes in our current city limits that has then those more restrictive standards. Is that from a practicality standpoint? Again, I know we're speaking hypothetically, but is that kind of what you're indicating?
Right, and what you also provide to the owners of property on that lake is due process for their situation. Right now, everybody that's moved to Lake Wasserman currently is operating underneath the Shoreland regulations that exist. If we were to create, higher standards of regulation, or whichever lake it may be, you're providing them an opportunity to engage in that due process.
Well, by implementing the current along with then the new, you're going to protect the homeowners on the existing, right? Isn't that really what we're trying to do? The ones that have had the bigger lot sizes, really trying to protect the current homeowners who operated under those standards.
I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah, that is what I'm hearing from this conversation, is that's the desire, is to protect that existing character.
Because
So,
of recreational development, those lakes are going to be potentially impacted the most. I think, you talked about, Paul, you talked about measures that we need to use to allow us to to create a basis of our widths. So, these recreational lakes, for example, Lake Virginia. I'm not familiar with that lake all that well, but is it a pretty small lake? I mean, how deep is the water? Is it likely to get a lot of boat traffic? I mean, if a lot of density comes around that lake, is it going to impact the water quality and things like that? I mean, if it's a shallow lake, then we know that it's probably not going to have a lot of boat activity. So those kind of considerations, I think, are important, just to kind of think about the actual body of water as well.
Right, and for example, on Lake Virginia, they have a public access. And so, I mean, it's as many people as can fit in that parking lot, I suppose, can put boats out. And so, it's a number of factors. It's complicated.
So, acting chair, commissioners, what I think I'm hearing, and again, chime in if I'm summarizing this wrong, is that there is a desire to maintain what is within the existing city ordinance as it relates to setbacks and lot area size on our current city limit lakes. But there is at least some interest in exploring whether or not there's a possibility to provide some of these less restrictive standards as we develop or as we grow outside of the city limits into some of those areas that are currently undeveloped. Is that an accurate summarization?
I would say yes.
Yes.
Agreed.
I think so.
Yes.
Great. Okay, we will.
Yeah, I would
we'll
agree
have
with
some
that
of those-
also.
We will have those conversations with the DNR and bring more information on that piece of it to our next joint meeting. All right, Alyssa, if you want to move on to where we left off. So I only have a couple more slides for tonight's discussion, and then of course you've all had an opportunity to kind of look through the DNR model ordinance, and we can allow any questions or feedback on that as well. So the next item I'm hoping we can have a little bit of discussion on is that water-oriented accessory structure. So at the last meeting, I think there was a consensus that there's a benefit to allowing those structures as an addition to what the regular accessory structures are allowed in typical standard zoning. So in the current red line, we've reflected that, and it basically says that you'd adhere to the city code section on accessory structures, which provides for your the number of structures, as Paul mentioned, the 2 out of the 3 between the shed, detached, and attached garage, plus 1 additional water-oriented accessory structure, which is then further defined in the Shoreland ordinance. Right now, with the DNR model ordinance baseline, that is a 10-foot setback from the ordinary high water line. It has typically a maximum size of 250 square feet, although as you'll recall from our last meeting, it does have that provision that allows for up to a 400 square foot structure on general and recreational development lakes if used for the storage of watercraft, which we discussed is pretty difficult to confirm and enforce. So just a few options to consider as we talk through this based on some of the feedback we've gotten. Is there a desire to prohibit the size of those water-oriented structures to that 250 and not provide that additional option to expand? Is there a desire to say, okay, we think that you can have that little bit larger boat structure, but maybe only on general development lakes? There was some discussion, do you even allow water-oriented accessory structures on natural environment lakes? Is the setback right? Is 10-foot setback the right setback? And then I think back to that previous discussion too about do you want to allow the ability to have water connected to those facilities, whereas right now the DNR model ordinance does not allow that. So that if that is a desire, that would also be some additional conversation with the DNR. So with that, again, I will turn it back to Acting Chair Moore to lead discussion.
All right, commissioners. Curious of your thoughts.
This is Mary Jo again. Somewhere, and I can't find the exact page and number, I read that a sauna would be a permitted use in one of these accessory dwellings. Now, how do you have a sauna without plumbing?
You bring in water. You bring in the water and you put it on the heat mechanism.
Yeah, so it doesn't require a drain or anything.
You're gonna get oxen to do that, or who's
No,
gonna?
you don't need a lot of water. You just need a couple buckets of water. You need a bucket of water.
For one sauna, pretty good.
Some saunas you can fire them with wood. You wouldn't even need electric.
Okay.
Yeah, commissioners, you're testing my knowledge of saunas and spas and how those are defined, but I believe you're correct. A sauna is typically more of your steam room, whereas a spa would be more of the hot tub type use.
Thank you. You can tell I've never had a sauna. Okay.
I'm fine with our current red line. I think the plumbing is nice, and we talked about could prevent some issues, but it seems like it could also bring some issues.
Isn't it important in some lakes to wash off your boat so you don't populate algae from one lake to the other?
I think here you're just storing your boat on your own lake. You're not pulling it out to move to another lake. But I know something about saunas. I know very little bit about boating, so I'll let somebody else answer that.
Yeah, I think that is also correct, right? A lot of times where you're seeing and you're seeing it become more of a standard because of the aquatic species is that you'd see those boat wash stations at a boat launch versus necessarily in a private setting, because most people are not going to be launching their boat from their own yard. They might have a dock where they're storing it in the water, but if they're bringing it out of the water, they're going to need to go to that launch, and then you've got the ability to rinse it off at the launch or rinse off in your front yard in your driveway with your garden hose before you take it back to store it again.
Good point. Thank you.
My thought on the, I mean, I kind of have the opinion that the current red line, I am okay with it. However, I do like the addition of the 400 square feet for storage. You know, if I'm on the lake and I have a boat and I have to go take my boat off and store it somewhere else, I would love to be able to store my boat on my own property over the winter. And it sure does look a lot nicer than having it open for the world to see. You know, to your point, Marty, though, it is hard to regulate. I think the only way to regulate that it's actually being used for boats is preventing plumbing.
Right, and I think, and I've added to my list of discussion items with the DNR over the next couple of weeks the plumbing question. Again, I'm just getting myself in trouble here because I'm making assumptions, but that again is my assumption as to why they don't want plumbing down there is because then it you know, makes it that much easier to slyly convert that into a lakeside cottage versus what it's intended to be. But I've added that to my list to talk to the DNR about as well. And just to clarify, the up to 400 square feet allowed on general and recreational development lakes, that is in the current red line as part of the DNR model ordinance. So if that is something that the commission wants to at least continue the process, leaving that in, that is part of the DNR model.
Also, Chair, Commission, this is Paul. You know, from the plumbing standpoint, you know, one of the tricky things about the plumbing down, say at the near a lake shore area, is that it's difficult to then pump things back up the hill. So a lot of this stuff has to be, you know, permitted. There's going to be a lot of work that need to be done in order to get something to actually work down there. And so hopefully, you know, they would come in for a plumbing permit and an electrical permit, and you know, it's probably all have to be metered as well. I don't know if you could just use your personal water lines, go underground, and then have it pop up into the shoreline area. So I mean, it's more complicated than, you know, just being able to put in a sewer line. It'd have to be grinder pumps, and if it's gray water, there's more to it than just the building itself.
This is Commissioner Kuhn. So when you're talking plumbing, you're talking sewer and water, not just allowing water down by the lake. Is that
right? if this thing were to, somebody were to try to convert this over to some sort of like dwelling unit, you know,
Right.
in the middle of the night, that would be very difficult to do. I mean, without putting like a, you know, storage facility for the sewer, or if you're planning on putting grinder pumps in or to then flush it back up the hill in order to get into the house's sewer system is very complicated. I mean, that's an undertaking.
So just before we move on, and I try to summarize again what I think I'm hearing, I think the crux of this specific item is that, are we as a city, are we comfortable with an up to 400 square foot structure allowed within 10 feet of the ordinary high water line on general and recreational development lakes? I think that's really what it comes down to with this specific item. Just knowing that if we allow that, we'll see them. We'll see those structures on those two types of lakes and close to the water. And there are requirements, I believe, as to what direction they need to face and how they need to be oriented down there. But that, I think, is the high level piece of this.
And currently, what do we allow?
I believe that we have this same language in our current ordinance. I want to double check that.
So
Paul, do you know offhand?
Not offhand. Yeah, maybe we can pull it up here. Just one second.
Yeah, we do allow up to 400 currently. It's section 22.210.
Yeah, it's sounding right. It's 200 with a bump to 4, I think. Is that right?
It's 250 with a bump to 4. So it's what is in the current red line.
Gotcha.
So yeah, so that would be essentially maintaining a standard we have in place now.
That's Commissioner Iverson, and are we in general agreement that we would not want to allow plumbing to that structure? What would generally be considered the function of plumbing?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
I think,
Commissioner Iverson, can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, I'm just cutting out like crazy with this. I would think that we would want to disallow plumbing to that structure.
Agreed for me.
I agree also, and there is, I'm sure everyone knows, technology that you can pump water from the lake and use it to water your flowers that you have decorating your lovely little structure down there, which is good, but I hope that you can't pump enough water to use for flushing.
And Chair, Commissioners, I think that I think that's probably the way to go, as I imagine that would have been a difficult ask of the DNR, as they don't allow it in their model ordinance, but as it was brought up in both meetings, I did want to discuss it again. So I think I'm hearing consensus that we dropped that from consideration. And again, just to summarize, I'm thinking we're all, at least this commission, is currently okay with the red line version, which is identical to what we have in our current ordinance.
I think the addition of the language that identifies vegetation and topography to hide the structure, I think also gives me more interest in increasing that square footage from 250 to 400. Is there anyone that has any opposition to this? All right, I guess we can take that as a no.
All right. Commissioners, I'm down to my last 3 slides here. So if you move on to the next slide here, the conversation, which we had a little bit of discussion on controlled access lots last time, as you'll recall, there was some consensus that you like the idea of being able to allow for that, but it should be a conditional use so that it needs to go through that public process where all feedback can be taken. And then, as I noted earlier, it would likely not be allowed within what that current red line PUD standards are with the shoreline dedication. As we've already discussed, we're going to be changing that, so we're going to go back to the DNR. So I don't believe that is any longer an issue. So the only question, I guess, that remains with those controlled access lots at this point in time is this something that we think should be allowed on all lakes, all 3 different classifications of lakes, or be restricted on any of those lake types? And again, just to clarify, this would be done through a PUD process, because you'd need to go through that process. So this wouldn't be any straight zoning type situation, I don't believe. We'll confirm that with the language, but.
Are there any examples that we can compare that you know of where lakes of this nature are completely private?
Where the entire lake is private?
Yes.
Ooh, I don't believe there are any in our current city limits or that I'm aware of in our growth area. Paul?
I have to think about it. I know Auburn has a public access, Steiger has public access, Wasserman has public access, Virginia has public access. I would go on a limb to say I don't know, like some of them are protected lakes like Church Lake and those, don't have public access. Just like I don't know if it has public access off the top of my head. I can't answer that. And then we don't have access to Lake Minnetonka, but that's public. That's my 1,000-foot view of that.
I'm personally of the opinion that we're a city of lakes and parks. I think that lakes should all be accessible. We're a fishing family, and we like to try all the lakes, and so I think preventing a lake from having public access, I don't think I'm in favor of.
Acting Chair Moore, Commissioners, just to provide some additional context to the controlled access lot. The controlled access lot isn't necessarily a public controlled access lot. That's really to our Waterford example. Again, with part of that development, the development maintained a piece of lakefront property that allows access to the lake from those homeowners through the HOA. So that I think controlled access is a little bit different from public access. So just want to make that distinction.
Okay. I misunderstood.
Yeah, just to be clear, I was thinking public access, not controlled. For some reason, I was thinking public access, but we do have, I think Minnetonka does have, we have a condo units that have shared access. Schutz Lake has shared access. And I think, I might go on a limb and say Zumbro Sunny may have it too in a certain area, but that's all I can think of.
Do you mind if you go back to the previous screen so we can just kind of see the red line language? Perfect, thank you.
Commissioner
Yeah.
Patterson.
Go ahead.
I think it's fine. I'm just in my mind's eye, I'm thinking like Schutz Lake, you can get on, but you have to have Three Rivers Park District permits, I believe. Don't quote me on that. And then where I'm thinking these controlled access lots would be like if you're driving along Minnewaska Parkway, you've got 15 houses in a neighborhood to your left if you're going north. And then there's like a sandy beach with a dock sticking out of it. And if you don't belong to whatever area, you can't get in there. I would say, not allowing that on all lakes would probably be a good thing. But having the ability to get it on some would be the right way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, just to clarify it, when I'm saying all lakes, I'm not necessarily meaning all lakes. I was referring to all lake types. So allowing it on general development, recreational development, and natural environment lakes.
Gotcha. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Commissioner Blazer, I think because it would have to go through the public process as it's written, right? I think we could make that determination as it comes up of whether or not it makes sense to have it on a particular lake or area. So I'm good with this.
There's also DNR language that really has a formula on how, these docks are calculated. So I think, we'll have the lake's best interest at that time if we have to review it, through a PED process.
All right, thank you. So I'm hearing, at least as of right now, let's leave it as it is currently in the red line as we continue our discussion. So if we want to move to the next slide, please. So this next slide, and this is something that we're going to need additional DNR feedback just on some preliminary conversations with them, but do just want to get Planning Commission's thoughts on a specific piece of this. So right now in the current red line, we've got an impervious surface table that kind of dictates what impervious surface is allowed in residential districts and some increased impervious surface for specific allowed uses that are within those underlined districts. As I've noted below there, there's some DNR concerns with that. So that's something that's going to need to be worked through and is likely going to change significantly as far as what those impervious surface numbers are. I think everyone is in agreement that for standard residential zoning, the 25% impervious, which is what our current ordinance says, what the DNR model says is the right number to use. It's just when you're looking at some of those other potential uses where there's some question. So happy to take any questions on that, but I think the thing really for discussion tonight is the DNR does have a optional standard when it comes to impervious surface to make that calculation development wide versus lot by lot. So our current ordinance and the base DNR model ordinance essentially requires 25% impervious surface on each lot, or only allows 25% impervious surface on each lot. Their optional language is that a city, if they want to have some more restrictive standards, is that you could require that 25% impervious surface 25% maximum impervious surface development wide, which could potentially address some of those other use issues in these areas. So I think that's just something. It's another item for the Planning Commission to think about is, do we want to go that added step and require that 25% impervious as an entire development?
I'll comment on that. You know, we've done this before for residential development within our, you know, other established neighborhoods, and it's fit us. I don't think it's the best approach. I think it's hard to manage sometimes, especially if there's a change in staff or a change in commissioners. I just, I think it's easier to have your impervious surface area and have it be applied to everyone. That's my personal opinion.
This is Terry Schwarting. I'm in agreement with that. In fact, my neighborhood had issues where they were allowed to share the impervious surface, and then when somebody goes to do something, you know, their particular lot, they kind of run up against the city saying, hey, you're over your limit, when the neighborhood was allowed to share it. So I agree.
Commissioner Pedersen, I agree with Commissioner Moore and Schwarting all the way. Thank you.
Commissioner Blazer, I agree as well.
All right. Sounds like we're hearing consensus then that we want to keep that a lot by lot calculation and not a development wide calculation. All right, and then my last slide is really just some additional items to think about based on some of that feedback that we got from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee. Not necessarily, we don't need to discuss all these items tonight, but as we continue this process, some things for you folks to consider. There was the tree removal item, which I think is an important one to talk about as we move through, and the desire or request or question about whether or not we should allow for the tree removal buyout. There was, as you'll recall, the issue about the ag zoning control when you're looking at developing a large agricultural parcel, but not all of that parcel is going to develop at the same time. We've talked a little bit about the management of catch basins already. Some additional protective standards that we've received some feedback on regarding watering and chemical use, that sort of thing. The item of the prohibition of flag lots and the ongoing training. So this was really just kind of a catch-all of some of those other items to think about as we move through. And then, as I noted, we do have some items that we need some additional guidance from the DNR, the impervious surface item being one of them, the non-conformities item being another, and then our commercial planned unit development, which we didn't talk about in depth tonight, because right now we really have it in a place that we're providing ourselves with a lot of flexibility, and I think we need to get some additional guidance from the DNR on at least some baseline standards that we should be considering for that. That once we have that, I think we can bring that up for a deeper dive like we did with some of these items today. So that really concludes my presentation. portion, unless Paul has anything else he'd like to add. And with that, I'd open it up for any additional questions or discussion on these items or other items, or just things you've noticed in your review.
This is Terry Schwarting. What's a flag lot?
So a flag lot is a lot that has just a very narrow parcel of land that is basically wide enough for a driveway. So it's bounded by, you know, what you'd think of as a regular sized or shaped parcel on either side, that then allows you to get back deeper behind those lots and have a riparian or a shoreline or shoreland lot behind it. Paul, that wasn't a very good explanation. Maybe you can do a better job of trying to describe that.
That sounds like poetry. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot that there's an extension of the front yard that protrudes to like the cul-de-sac, for example, and the front yard really doesn't start until it's almost behind the parcel that's in front of it. And so it kind of looks like the flag pole. So the pole of the flag goes to the road, and then the flag itself, or the lot itself, then is spread out. Oftentimes it's to get, you know, back in the day from odd subdivisions, to get more lots on a lake, to get more lake access. There's a number of reasons why, but they're very problematic.
Okay, no, I agree. I understand now. Thank you.
Yep.
Yep.
I have a quick question, if it's okay, if we can talk about the tree removal. On 8.23, this is within the performance standards for public and private facilities. The word limited clearing and trimming of trees, I struggle with the word limited. It doesn't provide a property owner a clear understanding of, or the city for that matter, a clear understanding of how much tree can be removed. It's funny when you're at Lake Minnetonka, sometimes you're on the lake and you see like no trees, and then you see some with a lot of trees. And you just wonder how that got approved, and if they did it and went through the process of just saying, well, I'll ask for forgiveness if I get caught. You know, I just think having clear expectations is always nice.
Chair, Commission, this is Paul. I mean, one aspect that we also incorporate into our comprehensive management of the shoreland is to also look at our tree removal and preservation plans, found I think in 105 of our environmental code in the municipal portion. But yeah, I mean, it's a bit vague. When somebody asks me or calls and says, you know, I want to clear some vegetation to put, say, like a stairs or a landing going down to the lake, and you know, you ask the question, are you doing vegetative removal? They say yes. Or you ask the question, then is it limited? You know, the answer is always, of course. And so it's hard to come to a conclusion as to what that means.
And acting chair, commissioners, we actually have on our list of ordinances to work through a similar process as we're doing right now with you all, is our tree preservation ordinance, for those very reasons, as that even our tree preservation ordinance is a little more prescriptive in how you're measuring what's removed and how you're measuring how much needs to be replaced and that sort of thing. But it's something that is also on our list to bring before this body to really take a deep dive into what is that saying, and is it saying what we want it to say? So I think those two pieces work together pretty well as we're continuing down this kind of ordinance review process with some of those more complicated ordinances.
Does anyone have any additional thoughts or feedback on these discussion items?
I would just like to compliment the staff for putting everything in this form so that our discussion remain focused all the way through on each item, because sometimes it's overwhelming to have huge ordinance to consider. And I thank you for the way you did this.
Thank you. Just one more quick note, if you want to go to the slide, I believe it's after the questions discussion slide, Alyssa. I think I provided this to all of you via email. As we're moving through this, we're adjusting timelines, and as outside factors are influencing, these obviously are all very tentative. But here's just kind of a snapshot of where we are currently and what our tentative timeline is on this process. So we are looking at having that joint meeting with the Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting at our next Planning Commission, which I think will be very valuable to get those voices all together, talk through things. We will have another just independent Lakes and Water Quality discussion after that in July. We are intending to allow the council to have just a discussion session on this as we continue to progress to make sure they're comfortable with where the direction things are heading. And then moving into that public hearing, which would be another opportunity to discuss and get that public feedback. And then obviously eventually at the end of this, we're hoping we get to a point where the council is considering an ordinance. And as I stated, as we work through this and as more issues come up or questions come up, excuse me, there's nothing set in stone with these timelines. So if we need to add additional meetings or we just can't cover everything we'd like to cover, that is also acceptable. That's all I've got.
All right. A lot of content. Thank you for all that. That was quite a bit to review. So thank you for that preparation. I know that must have taken some time.
Laura,
Yes.
I seem to be a little bit more verbal than usual this evening. June 16th, do you think the council chamber is large enough for the committee as well as the plan commission to be safe distances apart from each other, wearing our masks, but yet we can have eye contact with the other people? We could all be in the same room.
That's a great question. I sure would like to do that if that's agreeable with staff. I don't know.
Yeah, commissioners, I can speak to that just a little bit. I don't have a firm answer on that yet, but it is our intention now, as we have officially reopened City Hall with some social distancing guidelines, to develop a plan to be able to allow public access again into our council chambers. I think a lot of that will be predicated on what the guidelines are as far as meeting in a group and the social distancing guidelines. So it is something that we are working on internally, not just for Planning Commission, but for City Council and all of our meeting bodies, as to how we transition to start allowing that again. As we get through the next week or so, we'll hopefully have a better idea of what that's going to look like. And once we've kind of determined those guidelines, we can then do some calculation and see if we think that is going to be doable based on what those guidelines are. So I'll keep you posted on that, if it's something that will be an option by that point in time or not.
Thank you. That's great.
I think our public feedback will be important, and I think obviously we still have additional meetings before it's open to the public, but I think that'll be helpful at that point to do that. But that brings up a good point. We'll need some rules in place for that public hearing. And so that detail will need to be thought through as well.
Right, and that's really the biggest challenge with reopening the council chambers for these meetings to the public is the unknown as the number of people that will want to attend for any given item. So those are the discussions we're having, right? Is if you've all of a sudden got 50 people that want to be here and we've determined through our guidelines the capacity only allows for 35, what do you do with those other 15? Do you tell them they have to go home and watch online? So those are the things we're thinking through as we're trying to open back up. We don't want to end up in situations like that where we could potentially still provide that access remotely. So that's absolutely things that we're trying to figure out as we determine what that plan is for public meetings here in the next month or so.
Just think about churches on Easter Sunday and how they handled the overflow crowd.
That's to be determined.
Yeah.
Are we past that where we can have larger groups than 10 people together or not?
So right now, I believe the guidance is that for public spaces like this, that you can have more than 10 together, but you're still required to have those social distancing guidelines. So that's really what limits the capacity, is being able to maintain social distancing between commission and committee members, staff, members of the public. So it eats up those numbers that can actually physically fit in the room, doing that pretty quickly.
Understood. Thank you.
Commissioners, do you have any other miscellaneous items that you'd like to bring up? All right. If there are no more items to come before the commission this evening, I'd like to ask for a motion to adjourn. Please be sure to state your name when motioning or seconding. Commissioners?
Move to adjourn.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, can you repeat who that is?
Commissioner Pedersen, move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Commissioner Kuhn seconds.
Okay, thank you. Motion made by Peterson and second by Kuhn. I'm now going to take the roll call. Commissioner Kuhn?
Aye.
Commissioner Gar?
Aye.
Commissioner Iverson?
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarting?
Aye.
Commissioner Blazer?
Aye.
Acting Chair Moore? Aye. And Commissioner Peterson?
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you.